I'd love to read some of your things. Have you written about the war at all?
Not very much, no.
No, yeah.
That's something I'm not very keen on.
Yeah, I understand.
remembering.
Gordon, I'll just ask you a few simple questions. You look at me and not the camera. If you feel at all uncomfortable, don't want to talk, you just say no.
Right.
Okay?
Mhm.
This is it's all this is to educate the rest of Australians about what happened, because I don't want stories to disappear from history. I think it's important.
But speak up fairly well because my hearing's not as good as
I
it
will
might
speak
be.
up well. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, all right, like that, yes.
Good, okay. Gordon, how old were you when you joined the army?
Well, I became a senior cadet in 1934 at the age of 16 in the old Commonwealth military forces, and went up through the ranks then and was commissioned in 1940. I was then 22, and that was when I went into the AAF and had about 5.5 years there.
You were sent to Singapore.
Mm-hmm.
I understand it was a bit chaotic under curtain. A lot of soldiers didn't know where they were supposed to be. Did you find that the case?
You want to get this a bit clear. The 2nd 18th Battalion was part of the 22nd Australian Brigade. And the brigade group went to Singapore and Malaya in February 1941. We trained there as a brigade and as a battalion, and we were virtually trained professional soldiers by the end of 1941 when the war began. It was just about after then and immediately after that reinforcements were sent from Australia. And in February 1942, and just before the battle for Singapore itself began, I was sent a number of reinforcements for people who were lost up the peninsula. And 2 of those, I think, had never even fired a rifle. Now, that was the sort of thing the Australian government was doing to us in those days. And that was fairly common.
Sending reinforcements that had never fired
Yeah,
a gun in their life.
never fired a rifle, no.
That wouldn't have instilled you with confidence.
Well, if we'd had 6 months to train them and show them what to do and how to do it, it would have been all right because they were good chaps. But they were useless to us as they were, and useless to themselves. And in fact, I think both of them were killed because they really didn't know what they were doing.
At what point did you, was it apparent that the Japanese were taking over in Singapore? I mean, there was a bit of confusion. And how did you end up in Sumatra?
Well, the battalion went back to Singapore late in January 1942, and it was appointed as part of the 22nd Brigade, to defend the narrow parts of the Straits of Singapore, the Straits of Johor. It was a hopeless situation. The High Command in Singapore totally misjudged it. Expected the Japanese to land on the eastern side, whereas it was quite obvious to all the rest of us that they were going to land on the western side, because there was all the noise going on opposite as they were building their boats and stacking them and so forth. Now, the straits there are less than a mile wide, and they're fairly easy to cross in boats and so forth. So when the Japanese attacked with a couple of divisions against a brigade of 3 battalions spread out along miles of coast, there was no hope of holding them. Now, as it happened, and as it's recorded in the official history, my platoon was on a small island on the coast of the Straits, a tidal island. With the tide in, you couldn't get across except by boat. With the tide out, you could wade across through the mud. But we, in fact, were not, although we were shelled, we were not attacked in the landing. The Japanese just passed round us and swept up all the rest of the troops on the way. So on the morning of the Monday, that was before the capitulation on the following Sunday, we were simply left alone there. We'd suffered no casualties. As I say, we'd been heavily shelled, but we hadn't taken any casualties at all. So we set about trying to make our way back to the rest of the battalion. But it's a very difficult country up there. The river, River Kranji, makes almost a peninsula of where we were. Now, I didn't even have a map. As a platoon commander without a map in strange country, it shows you just how good the Singapore command was in this kind of thing. I blame the general commanding, but that's another matter. The result was that we just kept on butting into superior forces of Japanese all the way, taking a few casualties here and there. And I finally finished up on the southwest coast of Singapore Island with half a dozen men and myself. We still tried to get round to Singapore, but then we heard all the firing stop, and it was quite obvious that the place had surrendered, but there was no good going to Singapore. We did build a raft with the idea of getting round there, but the current was against us. You couldn't do anything with that. And then finally we found a sampan and made our way across to the Rio archipelago after various minor vicissitudes and some seasickness. We arranged with a Chinese junk there
I read that, amazing.
to take us across to the Indragiri River. The Chinese were a bit difficult about it first. Apart from striking a bargain, which of course the Chinese will do very well, my money, such as it was, had become stained by seawater. They thought it was blood and were very superstitious about taking it, so I had to persuade them that it wasn't blood. But I'll say this for the Chinese, that although they struck a hard bargain, they stuck to it to the very letter and were even better than that. We couldn't have wanted more from them. Anyway, we got to the Indragiri River, and there was an evacuation route had been arranged there for the survivors of the ships that had been sunk coming out of Singapore. And eventually I got to Padang on the west coast, and as I say, that was the 6th of March, 1942, and the last ship went out that night. I think it was sunk on the way, but I've never been able to verify that. Anyway, how did he get on it? So we cooled our heels. There was quite a group of evacuated personnel in Padang at that time, and we cooled our heels there until the Japanese came in on the 17th of March, and it just packed up. Colonel Warren, who was a colonel of the Royal Marines, was in command of all British Empire troops in Padang at that time, and he offered to form a guerrilla group to fight with the Dutch. We'd take to the mountains, you see, and live on the land. And it would have been quite practicable, but the Dutch weren't having any of it, and you could sympathize with them. So we simply became prisoners of the Japanese. One event in that thing that always rather pleased me was we were taken north from Padang up to Medan, which is up in the northeast more of Sumatra, and crossed the equator by road. Now, how many people do you know who've crossed the equator by road?
Very few.
Very few. So that was something out of it. Anyway, we then spent a couple of years in Blue. The war was warming up by then. The Japanese were getting edgy. They decided we were too near the front line, or might have been liberated, or heaven knows what. So they put us all on a ship to send us down to the south of Sumatra. But the British submarine, I think she was HMS Triumph from memory, sank the transport in which we were. Killed, of course, quite a number of folk. I was lucky enough to be on one of the upper decks at the time, and had about a few hours in the water, and then was picked up with this crack in the head. And eventually we arrived in Singapore, spending our time getting there on the deck of a tanker, wondering whether that might be torpedoed too and what chance we'd have if a tanker went up. Freezing by night and cooking by day, and not feeling very happy with the world. Then when we got into Singapore, they sent me out to Changi, and I spent the rest of the war there, and that was July 1944 till the end of the war in August 45.
Can you, because we can't as future generations understand how absolutely challenging the conditions were being a prisoner of war, how tough it was being a prisoner of war. From an emotional perspective as well, because you were a platoon commander, and having that taken away from you, as well as tough circumstances, could you try and explain to us, Gordon, how tough it was?
I don't know that I can explain it. It's a tremendously uncomfortable position. You're not free, you see. Merely, and more than that, not being just merely not free. You're not free, but under the command of an irrational, barbarous captive force, who'd use any sort of brutality that they felt like any time. Now, this is psychologically very demanding, but it was quite remarkable how well the troops stood up to it. This business of mateship, you know, it's not peculiar to Australians. The British forces, and I suppose the Dutch and others, all had the same kind of characteristic, and they did support each other in that kind of way. But so far as the AIF were concerned, they were very good. There was a warrant officer, class 1, from a transport unit. There, he was the senior non-commissioned officer in our group. Although he'd been wounded himself, he'd lost an arm, I think. He was a very good influence on the troops. And there were other NCOs there of the same kind. Paddy Harrington, who'd been a warder in Bathurst jail and always moaned that the Japanese had taken him prisoner on St. Patrick's Day, the 17th of March. St. Patrick had let him down, you see. But he was good. He wasn't well either. There was that kind of strength in the Australian troops, quite apart from the individuals themselves.
What do you attribute your survival to?
Sheer good luck.
Really?
I had the backside of my rifle shot off in action at one stage. Well, if that had been a millimetre one way or the other, it would have got me, I suppose, and I wouldn't be here now. But I don't think you can, you know, it's something you can't control yourself, it just happens. But if you've got the will to survive, that makes a big difference.
You obviously had the mental fortitude.
But it had to have. Either that or you're packed up, you see. There was a tragic case in our unit. of a lance sergeant who was very good indeed. He'd been in charge of mine laying. Now this personnel mines, you lay so that there's a short tripwire. And if you walk through the minefield and kick the tripwire, then a wee bomb flies up about 2-3 feet and blows off. And of course catches you around the middle. Now it's frightfully dangerous work. And there were monkeys round the place. Now this sergeant was in charge of laying this minefield, and he had, against all orders, a habit of going in to replace those that had been set off by the monkeys. That's the sort of courage he had. Well, in fact, he was badly wounded. He was in hospital after the show closed down. He lost a leg, and he lost the will to live. He needn't have died, he could still be alive, but he just couldn't be bothered, and he died. Now, that shows the difference. If you've got the will to live, you're right. If you haven't, well, there it is. But it's extraordinary what the human frame will stand if it wants to.
Look at you today, nearly 92, a remarkable man.
Oh, not
But you've
really.
had that trauma in your life, and you're still in good health.
Well, good health for 92, perhaps. Not wonderfully good health, but I feel all right most of the time, and I get round all right.
What did you look forward to most upon returning home? What was the one thing you thought, I can't wait?
I think, to be quite honest, most of us looked forward most to getting a good meal and stop being hungry.
Yeah.
This hunger, when you're deprived of adequate food for a long, long period, eats into you. And much of the time you can't think of anything but good food. We used to plan, for example, doing a restaurant cafe crawl along Pitt Street and eating a meal at every cafe we came to.
These
But
are
of
your
course,
fantasies.
once you've had a few good meals, all that disappears.
Yeah. You had a bowl of rice a day?
Well, more or less that, yet it varied a bit. But rice was always a staple. You never got quite enough of it. Medical officers did all they could in urging. We did get 1 or 2 Red Cross parcels with some useful stuff in it. Marmite, for example, which has vitamins and so forth. But no, apart from that, I think one wanted to get back to one's family. I had a wife and a wee daughter I'd never seen. She was 4.5 by the time I did see her.
What was it like seeing a daughter for the first
Oh,
time?
wonderful.
Oh,
But that runs in the family, you see. My uncle went off to 1914. His second son was over 4 by the time he saw him. My daughter was more than 4.5 when I saw her. And a cousin of mine, likewise, had a son.
oh, it's amazing.
And there were lots of them like that, all through the AIF.
Of course there were.
All through the British forces.
So when your wife said, this is your little girl, what was it like holding this little person?
Pretty wonderful.
That would give you the will to live, I think. Yeah. Today, Gordon, we can't understand how difficult it was for you, but for future generations, what message would you hope we could take away from what happened there?
Never have a war again. It's as straightforward as that, I think. It's just true, isn't it? War is, well, horrible. You see people, well, without going into the horrors of it, you know what it's like in a butcher's shop. But when you see people that you've been working with and living with in that state, like cut up meat in a butcher's shop, it's not very good. And it really doesn't get you anywhere. You've got to do that to other people, the enemy whom you come to hate anyhow. But there should never be war. Not now. There's no need for it. But you can't persuade everybody of that.
Does it dishearten you that Australian soldiers are still involved in other people's wars currently?
Well, it's a question whether it's other people's wars or Australia's wars. I mean, you hear people now saying, well, Australia should never have been in the Great War. It had nothing to do with us, which is just absurd. It was a great deal to do with us. Had Germany won the Great War, Australia would have been under German domination before very long. There was no question of that. Had the Japs won this last war, heaven knows we wouldn't be here now doing this kind of thing. It's so there comes a point where you have to fight in your own defence, but it should never come to that.
Well, I feel very privileged to have spoken to you today.
Oh, no.
I really do. And thank you, Gordon, for your time and your stories.
I don't think I've done it very well, but I haven't rehearsed anything. And
You've done it very well. How do you feel, Gordon?
Very proud.
You should be proud. We're proud of you.
Ah.